How much do you really know about North Korea? This secretive country continues to provoke the world's curiosity. This is a record of how one of the most hated nations on Earth managed to survive. Born on the front lines of the Cold War, the state repeated increasingly closed choices over time. The path from ruins and famine to nuclear weapons was not an accident, but the result of accumulated decisions. Now, we follow the turning points that shaped North Korea over the past 70 years and led it to the present. In 1948, this country was designed from birth to serve an external need. As the Cold War hardened, a new state was established in the northern half of the Korean peninsula. The Soviet Union needed a buffer zone and a controllable satellite state. Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter, was chosen for the role. Land reform was pushed through rapidly, and social rules changed in a short time. Punishment of those labeled as collaborators was harsh, and fear spread like order. Amid the chaos, some people felt the new system was more just and stable. At the time, North Korea appeared ahead of the South in industrial facilities and power generation. But the state focused on building its military before its civilian society. Troops, logistics, training, and command structures became the priority. Outwardly, a nation was born, but in reality, a system built for war was taking shape. Once that structure was complete, the next step was not policy, but action. At dawn on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and advanced south. Soviet-made tanks led the way, and the assault looked fast and decisive. The calculation was simple. If the peninsula could be seized quickly, everything would be over. At first, events seemed to confirm that belief. But war always hides variables no one can fully predict. With US intervention, the battlefield expanded and the conflict dragged on. What was meant to be a short war turned into a war of attrition. Over 3 years, cities, factories, roads, and bridges were destroyed. Pyongyang was almost completely leveled. The war ended without victory, leaving only an armistice line. This failure demanded an explanation from the regime, and how that explanation was made became the next turning point. Outwardly, it was reconstruction, but inwardly, power was being emptied. From the ruins, the state began rebuilding at remarkable speed. The Chalima movement mobilized the population on a massive scale. People spent most of their days at work sites. Factories resumed operation, and production increased. On the surface, the recovery looked miraculous. Behind that speed, however, political consolidation was underway. Kim Il-sung sought to eliminate the uncertainty that followed defeat. Around 1956, political factions backed by the Soviet Union and China were removed. Alternative voices disappeared. Reconstruction restored daily life, but it also completed the monopolization of power. The state grew more solid, built on single-minded loyalty. What remained was to turn that power into unquestioned common sense. In 1972, power became a system and a belief. Around Kim Il-sung's 60th birthday, a new constitution was adopted. Orthodox Marxism retreated into the background. The Juche idea became the core of state governance. The leader was described as the brain of the nation, the people as its moving limbs. Statues rose across the country, and everyday spaces became sites of reverence. External information diminished, while internal messaging flowed in one direction. Economic growth slowed, and daily life became more rigid. Military spending, meanwhile, continued to rise. Even so, citizens were told they lived in a prosperous society. Narrative began to outweigh reality. Yet, the strongest pillar supporting this system was not internal, but external. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the regime's shield shattered with it, In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. For North Korea, this was not a diplomatic event, but the loss of its lifeline. Supplies of cheap oil and food were cut off. Factory machines stopped, and production faltered sharply. Agricultural equipment was abandoned, weakening harvests and transport. A planned economy ceased to function the moment supply chains broke. While the world celebrated the end of the Cold War, North Korea entered a brutal winter. Shortages of electricity and fuel disrupted both production and distribution. Small disruptions quickly spread into systemic collapse. People began to feel cracks in daily life, and state promises faded into words. Before this anxiety could settle, an even greater crisis arrived. In the summer of 1994, Kim Il-sung died. Soon after, severe flooding damaged farmland and infrastructure. Already weakened supply networks collapsed completely. The public distribution systems stopped functioning. This period came to be known as the Arduous March. Estimates suggest that millions died of starvation. The state could no longer feed its people. But people still had to survive. Informal markets began to emerge, and goods passed hand to hand. New survival methods grew outside the system. To the regime, these cracks were a threat, and power was pushed toward a single conclusion. In 2006, the regime chose its most dangerous insurance policy. Kim Jong-il's government conducted a nuclear test. The international community responded with harsh sanctions. North Korea was pushed into even tighter isolation, and the economy worsened. The regime, however, did not see this as retreat. Nuclear weapons were not a bargaining chip, but a guarantee against interference. The risks others had to bear changed. North Korea began to be defined not as a poor dictatorship, but as a nuclear-armed state. That definition reshaped both its status and its isolation. The logic of survival hardened. At the same time, the path back narrowed. It was on this structure that a new succession began. Any hoped-for change could exist only within that narrow path. When the young heir inherited this fortress, he moved fast to secure his throne. Within 2 years, he had purged his own uncle and eliminated anyone who might challenge his rule. Lacking the revolutionary credentials of his grandfather, he needed new sources of legitimacy. He declared the Byung-jin policy, simultaneous pursuit of nuclear weapons and economic development. The parades became grander, the missiles larger, the tests more frequent. Every launch was a statement of defiance, a proof of power. But these weapons were no longer just deterrents. They had become the regime's very identity. He convinced himself that this arsenal was the key to being treated as an equal by the great powers of the world. That conviction led him to Hanoi. He boarded his armored train for a 60-hour journey, believing he could trade partial denuclearization for sanctions relief. He thought he could have both, the security of nuclear weapons and the prosperity of economic opening. But the two sides could not bridge the gap. Washington demanded more than Pyongyang was willing to give. Pyongyang demanded more than Washington was willing to offer. The summit collapsed without a deal. The long journey back home was a ride of bitter reflection. Whether humiliated or simply realistic, he drew a conclusion. The world would not meet him halfway. And so, he decided to stop reaching out. Instead, he would turn inward, bolting the door tighter than ever before. And so, we arrive at today. The result of these 10 turns is a hermit kingdom more sealed than ever before. In 2020, they shut the borders completely, citing the pandemic, and never fully reopened. In 2024, they declared the South a permanent enemy state, blew up the inter-Korean roads and railways, and began sending trash-filled balloons across the border. They have mined the borders, severed the ties, and rejected any notion of reconciliation. They are no longer just a country. They are a self-imposed solitary confinement. Safe, perhaps, behind their nukes and walls, but profoundly, utterly alone. This is what survival looks like when fear becomes the blueprint. A country can seal its borders and still bleed from the inside. In the end, the fortress stands, but the cost is loneliness and a future that keeps getting smaller. Was isolation inevitable, or was it chosen? Tell us where you think the path truly closed. Thank you for watching.